We gonna keep moving. Hey, shalom, shalom. How y'all doing? Welcome back, everybody, to Reading with SHILO. It's SHILO in this thing, man. Late at night. Something ain't right. We're gonna go ahead and get chapter 6, section 4 down tonight. We're gonna get section 4 down. Pink lemonade. Oh, bam. Section 4 of chapter 6 of On the Real Side, The New Negro by Get Back, Sucker. By Mel Watkins. On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. The history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. You know, it's so far so good, man. We're moving along in the book. We're moving along, baby. You know, things are moving. Some days I'm reading good, so we're gonna see today or tonight gonna be another good reading night. We're gonna see. We gotta push through, no matter if it is or it isn't. We're gonna push through one word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, one book at a time, until we go ahead and find some stuff that can help us build our minds. Hopefully help us find the things that we need to find to grow with. See if there's anything that we can learn and grow from in section 4 of chapter 6, The New Negro, man. The New Negro. And so far, so good, man. They are getting into some areas that I think I'm a little bit more familiar with. But if, you know, to all the newcomers, if there are words that I stumble upon that I know I don't know, I will take a pause for the cause. Look them up, write them down, look them up, whether it be in the dictionary or we'll Google the pronunciation of it to make sure that the words are being pronounced right. So we'll try to find a good flow tonight as we continue to push forward, marching on, baby, marching on through section 4, which is not that many. It's not that long, maybe like 4 or 5 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 pages. So we should be able to push through these 5 pages, which is really 10 pages front to back. But we're going to push through the 5 pages of section 4 and see what we can see. See what we can see from Mr. Mel Watkins, man. We are almost halfway through the book. In yesterday's reading, you know, about time we get to chapter 8. I think chapter 8 would be about halfway. I'm gonna look about halfway through the book, man. So we're gonna see. We are going to see. We're gonna push on. So, On the Real Side by Mel Watkins, chapter 6, The New Negro. And some other stuff. Let me get it. The New Negro, Harlem and Hollywood, exotics, imposters, and other mishappen identities. Section 4. You know, sometimes I wish they had like names or something to these sections, but they don't. It's just a number. So you get what I get. You will get what I get. Section 4. There was immense variation in the style with which they played the roles. Yet nearly everyone on the performers, nearly every one of the performers who benefited from the rush to enlist black performers into sound films ultimately was cast as a servant. It was a role with a venerable tradition in Hollywood, both on the screen and off. In its formative years, with few exceptions, blacks had found the Hollywood community virtually impenetrable except by way of service jobs. By the early 20s, only a few professional actors, among them Noble M. Johnson, George Reed, Madame Sultan, and child actors such as Ernie Morrison appearing regularly in films. Johnson's light complexion and sculpted features enabled him to find exotic parts as Mexicans, half breeds, and Indians in a host of movies from the 20s to the 40s. He braces numerous supportive roles in Hollywood's B movies with a career with the Lincoln Company. The equally exotic Madame Sultan made her debut in The Birth of a Nation, appeared in a 1920 Elko Studio black cast comedy series, then went on to appear sporadically as a voodoo priestess or maid in a number of films. Reed also appeared in Birth and played Nigger Jim in the 1920 version of Huckleberry Finn before being typecast as a porter, stable hand, or butler in a series of films during the years that followed. Morris was a featured child star before departing for Vaudeville, my bad. Later, he returned to Hollywood as a comic sidekick in teenage gang movies. Even those accepted performers had difficulty supporting themselves. Morris left Hollywood for Vaudeville because of inadequate wages, and Madame Sultan, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Miss Sultan, would complain that I get bitter sometimes because I don't work long enough to buy a handkerchief. Most blacks appearing in early Hollywood movies had more precautious and unsettling relationships with the industry. Many had entered through the accepted route of service positions as porters, boot black elevator operators, valets, or maids. Often, since genuine acting was considered beyond the capacity of blacks, aspirants for parts would consider beyond the capacity of blacks. Aspirants for parts were considered interchangeable, and in the throwback to slavery, favors or parts were bestowed on the most accommodating types. According to Thomas Cripps, until the late 1920s, when studios turned to the Central Casting Corporation and its black agent Charles Butler, studio Negroes such as Jimmy Smith, Harold Garrison, and Oscar Smith functions as liaisons between the film industries and the black community. They were charged with scanning Watts Central Avenue for any potential talent, a quality that included the proper unconsciousness. Unconsciousness. I don't know what that word is. Yeah, I don't even. I mean, I might have to look up the pronunciation. Something. UNCTUOUSNESS. Do you know how to pronounce it? Let's check and see if Google does. Google. Google me this. UNCTUOUSNESS. Uncouthness? Uncouthness? I hate when I can't get the pronunciation.
Unctuous.
Unctuous. Unctuous. Unctuousness. Unctuousness. They were charged with scanning Watts' Central Avenue for any potential talent, a quality that included the proper unctuousness. Unctuousness. Let's go back to the definition. Unctuousness. Smug, self-serving earnestness. Unctuousness. In addition to his role as a talent scout, Smith appeared in several Paramount featured films in the late 20s. Among them were Beau Sabriere in 1927, in which Gary Cooper starred in Thunderbolt 1929. Smith, like so many blacks who gained the foothold in the industry during this period, broke in as a retainer. He came to Paramount after World War I as Wallace Reed's valet. In gratitude for his services, and apparently with no disdain or sardonic intent, Reed stipulated in his will that Smith be given a shoe shine stand in perpetuity. Garrison, who worked with King Vidor on Hallelujah and in releases to the black press, was identified as an assistant director, was known to whites at the studio as Kid Slickum due to his facility as the boot black. I wonder what that is. A boot black. It's probably a shoe shine boy. Boot black. Boot black.
Boot black.
A person employed to polish boots and shoes. A shoe shine boy. Both Smith and Garrison made optimum use of their backdoor entry, extracting as much power, influence, and exposure as possible from the situation. African Americans, apparently eager acceptance of servant positions and use of servile attitudes as a means of advancement, of course, was not confined to Hollywood or the film community. Performers were following a well-trodden path. Throughout the nation, from legitimate race leaders such as Booker T. Washington, cast down your bucket where you are, to con men and hustlers who milked white egos and pocketbooks with ingratiating postures and affirmations of satisfaction with their inferior positions. Outward accommodations of bigotry was common means of circumventing restricted opportunities. For most ordinary people, although the rewards were not so readily apparent, such accommodation, as it had been during slavery, was often required for survival. Those employed as domestics almost universally adhered to a pragmatic philosophy of deceit that reaffirmed employers' views of blacks as an unambitious, simple, if not simple-minded, and contented lot. The facade not only elicited small favors, but brought some measures of status in the black community. There, the domestics' access to white society's material comforts was invaded, and tales of employers' gullibility and arrogance were cherished as a source of private humor. Rufus Thomas, the black disc jockey and rhythm and blues singer, mirrored a common attitude among blacks when he recalled his tactics as a waiter in Nashville during the 20s. During that time, the white fellow was quite boastful. He'd say all these things, but he'd pay well, pay well. At the end of the night, I had the money. I won't say that he was broke, but he'd splurged and I had the money. And so you ask yourself, hell, who's the fool and who's stupid? Because I had the money at the end of the night, and that was what I was working for. The film capital was in the business of selling fantasy and glamour, and movie stars were often urged to flaunt their wealth. Servants were part of the paraphernalia of stardom, symbols of success. So nearly every successful star had a houseboy, a valet, or a maid. When Stephen Fetching, as the first black movie star, toured Central Avenue in a pink Rolls Royce with his name emblazoned in neon on its side and bragged of having 14 Filipino servants, he was simply mimicking, in his own outlandish manner, a lifestyle common in the film community. Positions as Hollywood domestics were coveted because of the peripheral rewards. Occasionally, as with Oscar Smith, black retainers were allowed to duplicate the roles on the screen. Libby Taylor, Mae West's maid in real life, was also cast as a servant in several movies, including her employer's Belle of the 90s in 1934. The line between screen fantasy and reality for the Hollywood community was thin indeed, as blacks were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, along with exotics like Filipinos and Chinese. They were preferred for real life roles as domestics. And since blacks were assumed to be natural servants, they were acceptable in movie roles as domestics, parts in which, like black minstrels who were advertised as the real thing, they were required only to be themselves. Just act like you niggas. Just do you. From 1915 to 1920, roughly half of the Negro roles reviewed in Variety were maids and butlers, writes Thomas Cripps, and 74% of them were known in the credits by some demeaning first name. In the 1920s, servile roles reached 80% of all black roles. But with the advent of sound films and the recruitment of more professional black entertainers in the 30s, the percentage diminished. This move did not represent any shift in social consciousness or racial attitudes, but rather an increase in parts for blacks as natives in films set in Africa and other exotic locales, or for performers such as Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, or Hazel Scott, who portrayed themselves. Among portrayals of black females, the hefty, bandana clad black maid, the Hollywood mammy, predominated. There were, of course, a host of black actresses who at one time or another played servants in studio movies, although not all complied with the mammy stereotype. For Madame Sultawan, through Gertrude Howard, Teresa Harris, Libby Taylor, Moretta Canty, Evelyn Pryor, on the Ethel Waters, and yes, even jazz immortal Billie Holiday and stunning Dorothy Dandridge and Lena Horne, black women routinely donned apron and or bandana and made brief supporting appearances in Hollywood illusory, nearly all-white screen world. Hattie McDaniel, by virtue of her charisma, massive stature, and even more immense talent as a comic actress, set the standard for the mammy caricature. Although Louise Beavers and Butterfly McQueen were close contenders, she emerged as the diva of domestics. Early in Hollywood films, as we saw, female servants had been given license to deliver uh, acerbic one-liners and display an aggression and independence usually denied black males. Assertive, fiery, witty, and cantankerous, McDaniel added a patina of belligerence and surliness that in real life was usually carefully concealed. Well, I like that. That in real life was usually carefully concealed. But in real life today, that is the caricature of most and many Western females of any race, including blacks. The assertive, fiery, witty, cantankerous attitudes. That element, although it ultimately upset both blacks and whites, revealed the relationship between servant and employer as far more complex, ironic, and humorous than the Uncle Tom or Aunt Jemima stereotypes might suggest. It was also more pointedly realistic, providing a glimpse of the underside of the docile, contented servant myth. McDaniel was born in Wichita in 1898. She began in show business as a teenager, singing in tent shows in the South and Midwest before breaking into vaudeville and appearing on the Orpheum circuit in the 20s. Around 1930, she moved to Los Angeles and, shortly afterward, got her first movie role. After her film debut in relatively uno, unobtrusive, uno, unobtrusive, unobtrusive. After her debut in relatively unobtrusive minor roles as a domestic in The Gold West in 1931, Blonde Venus 1932, and The Story of Temple Drake in 1933, she quickly developed the wisecracking, irreverent image of a domestic that made her famous. By the mid 30s, she was one of the most sought after black actresses in Hollywood. Although she occasionally sang in movies such as Saratoga in 1937 or appeared in variety films such as Thank Your Lucky Stars in 1943, in which she joined Willie Best for a song and dance number, McDaniel was primarily a comic actress. And although she sometimes appeared as a demurring mate of malingering coon figures in such movies as Judge Priest in 1934 or Maryland in 1940, her forceful screen presence was almost exclusively in roles acerbic, as an acerbic, somewhat eccentric domestic. Let's look up acerbic. Acerbic. Yeah, acerbic. Acerbic. Acerbic.
Acerbic.
Acerbic. Acerbic, especially of the comment or style of speaking, sharp and forthright. His acerbic wit.
Acerbic.
Acerbic. In a series of films during the 30s and 40s, she functioned as a comic foil for glamorous actresses, including Jean Harlow, Marlene Dietrich, Claudette Colbert, and Vivian Leigh. As her more refined and demure, but usually less assured female bosses waffled in the face of male advances and incursions, or in the case of the Civil War films, Northerner interlopers, she remained steadfast and unshakable. Her size over 200 pounds, commanding voice, and lacerating rejoinders, and asides established an indomitable presence on the screen, and the line between boss and servant was often obscured. In Alice Adams in 1935, McDaniels plays an unkept domestic who, during the course of the dinner party, hardly advises her employer on the proper menu, argues rude commands from guests, and, with nimble facial expressions, displays obvious contempt as the pretentious hostess, Katharine Hepburn, attempts to impress her guests and disguise critical remarks about the service by speaking in French. The New York Times singled out McDaniel's performance as hilarious, and in 1989, on the 16th annual Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame Awards program, Gregory Hines called this comedic performance one of the most brilliant strokes of social commentary in American film. In The Mad Miss Matin of 1938, her irascibility and fussiness are heightened as she comments on Barbara Stanwyck's suitors. Seems like the pipsqueak to me. Snaps at a caller at the door. I ain't deaf. Or told to discourage one of Stanwyck's admirers. Hit him with the water pitcher. Orders is orders, she comments, but I use distilled water. In Affectionately Yours in 1941, her role was contrasted with Butterfly McQueen's fumbling, whimpering domestic and amused, even greater comic impact. In one scene, after Merle Oberon gives instructions about where guests are to be seated for dinner and leaves the room, McDaniel, who disapproves of both the arguments or arrangements and her employer's new boo, turns to the equally unhappy McQueen and says, "My queen, take them plates over there and put them over here, and I'm going to break them one by one over his head." In this film and several others, McDaniel behaves like the actual mistress of the household. She is the irrepressible arbiter of taste, and when her often naive or short sighted employers are in danger, the guardian of their rights, a bastion against male aggressiveness. Humor is derived from her assertive, almost mannish behavior, as well as her candidness about racial bias, male female relationships, and the alleged superiority of her employers. Added to this overtly assertive humor was the visual comedy associated with the contrast between the hefty McDaniels and her suavity, more feminine employers. Here, McDaniel's illusions about her femininity often became the object of the satire. In China Seas in 1935, for example, a distressed Jean Harlow asked if her maid thinks she looks like a lady. "Nossa, Miss Dolly," McDaniel replies, "I've been with you too long to insult you that way." Then Harlow asks, "What's that snooty English dame got that I ain't got?" After pausing for a second, McDaniel says, "She more refined, like she would never wear that dress with all them shiny beads you got. That dress is more my type." Harlow consents to give up her dress, even though she is aware that she's being conned. Afterwards, McDaniel holds that sleek garment against her body and mumbles, "I got to let this out a smidgen." The scene illustrates the underlying irony of McDaniel's irreverent domestic. What was given in assertiveness was quickly canceled by personal ridicule. Although she is allowed to outsmart her dizzy but beautiful employer, simultaneously she is lampooned because of her appearance and size, elements that were continually source of amusement during a period that one newspaper derisively labeled the fat, black, and ugly era of black representation in movies. But even when she is unwittingly the butt of the joke, McDaniel's screen image is usually without the slightest hint of inferiority. In fact, as she played the part, the assumption is that she is preeminent, and while writers and producers no doubt intended that her imperious attitude would be deflected by the various contrasts between the two women, for many of in the audience, the weight of McDaniel's personality often counterbalanced her physical heft and negated the slanted implications. McDaniel's characterizations were so realistic and apparently galling that many white Southerners protested her mammy portrayals. Perhaps as a result, after she won an Oscar as Best Supporting Actress in Gone with the Wind in 1939, her roles became less assertive and lost much of their edge. In the late 40s, she starred in Beulah in the radio series of that title and briefly assumed the same role on television in the 50s. But the energy and cutting irreverency of her mid-30s movies was not quite repeated. She was stricken while playing Beulah on television and died in 1952. McDaniel, like every black entertainer who gained fame portraying menials and servants, were criticized by many blacks. And in films such as Since You Went Away in 1944, in which she plays Fidelia, a fiercely dedicated maid whose loyalty to her beloved white folks supersedes concerns for her own welfare, her screen characters could slip hopelessly into a quagmire of Southern romanticism. Nevertheless, until the emergence of black television comics in the 70s, no one, not even her male counterpart Eddie Anderson, who portrayed the valet Rochester on Jack Benny's radio and television shows as well as his movies, brought nearly as much vigor, flamboyance, and impious wit to the role of a domestic as did Hattie McDaniel. Now, Louise Beavers offered a more traditional but less threatening and humorous portrayal of that part. Faithful, warm, and endeavoring, her screen interpretations more closely mirrored the reassuring image displayed at Aunt Jemima pancake products. They were, no doubt, also closer to the image retained by many Southern gentlemen raised in doting arms of black mammies. Hmm. In fact, Beavers played Aunt Delilah, a maid who gives her secret pancake flour mix to her employer, Claudette Colbert, and makes her wealthy, in Imitation of Life in 1934. Now on screen, she repeatedly portrayed the imperturbable, imperturbable, stalwart retainer whose dedication and loyalty were beyond question. Her film image was that of Uncle Tom's opposite number. She was the female version of the cheerful, loving, self sacrificing, somewhat naive servant whose mere presence gave credence to the status quo. Beaver's film career, began after she left her native Cleveland and moved to Los Angeles around the advent of talkies. In 1929, at age 22, she had several bit parts as maids in such films as Coquette, Coquette Barnum's Was Right, and Our Game, Comedy Election Day. By the 30s, her career accelerated as Clementine, Petulia, Niagara, Willamette, Cassie, and Just Plain Mammy. She reenacted the role of contented servant, friend, in score of Hollywood films. And although she occasionally appeared in parts that veered from the stereotype, for example, Bullets or Ballads in 1936, in which she played a Harlem numbers queen, and Follow the Boys in 1944, a universal variety showcase that also featured W.C. Fields and Nicodemus Stewart, and the Jackie Robinson story in 1950, in which she had a dramatic part as Robinson's mother. She was used almost exclusively in supporting roles as a domestic. During her 5 decades in films, Beavers established a reputation as a fine actress. Her repetitive parts never seemed to fatigue her, and she managed to bring a sincerity and authenticity to each role. Surprisingly, unlike the characters portrayed by Stephen Fetchit or even Hattie McDaniel, Beaver's domestics elicited few critical outcries from the black community. She was as well loved by blacks as by whites. The reason may be that Beavers, despite the stereotype, played the parts with more sincerity and genuine warmth than anyone else, projecting a deeply felt sense of the value of commitment, perseverance, and concern for others, no matter what position one happened to occupy. While they provided little opportunity for comedy or satirical edge, those attributes helped make Beavers one of Hollywood's most frequently employed and enduring black actresses. In the early 50s, Beavers, following Hattie McDaniel, starred as Beulah on radio and later played the part on television. Now, Ethel Waters initially played the role when the series debuted in 1950. Her career continued into the 60s when, in her last film, she appeared as Bob Hope's maid in The Facts of Life in 1961. When she died a year later, she was remembered fondly as the comforting Earth Mother figure she had so vividly projected on the screen. Butterfly McQueen was light years away from the mammy figures etched by Beavers and McDaniel. As a domestic servant, she was even quicker than McDaniel, whose belligerent outbursts seemed pragmatic and utterly sane in comparison to her fragile, otherworldly demeanor, was in total contrast to the cheerful practicality of uh, Louise Beavers. Now, born in 1911 in Tampa, Florida, McQueen displayed an early interest in acting. So, when she and her mother moved to New York City, she joined the amateur stage company. By the 30s, she had won bit parts in Brown Sugar and Brother Rat. Her cinema career began with her being selected in the role of Prissy of being Gone in the Wind. Now, McQueen brought her own unique comic spirit to her few Hollywood domestic roles, and ultimately, the whimsical characters she portrayed seemed to float not only above the scenes in which she appeared, but above the movie itself. In a sense, her comic persona was the female counterpart to Stephen Fetching, mumbling, frightened, malingering, coon. Like Fetching, she could become totally self-engrossed, incoherently drifting off into solemn or solemnant sphere of her own. Yet her lethargy was not so much physical as mental. She seemed perpetually detached from the reality of her films. In Affectionately Yours, appearing with McDaniel, she played a teary-eyed maid who quaked at the slightest mishap, real or imagined. Skittish and fragile, her presence served to exaggerate McDaniel's bombast and aggressiveness. And in Gone with the Wind, as Prissy, a house servant, or as Rhett laughingly refers to her, the simple-minded darky, McQueen fancifully meanders through the film as if the brutal Civil War background were the carnival. Here again, her quixotic in insouciance contrasts with McDaniel's portrayal of Mammy, who, with her fierce concern for property, decorum, and perpetuation of the South's social hierarchy, often took her white masters more seriously than they took themselves. Although McDaniels won the Oscar, it was McQueen who Time magazine cited for her sly humor. In essence, McQueen brought the comic guise that she had established on stage to her screen roles. Her wide-eyed innocence, confused, undirected speech, shrill, high-pitched voice, and little girl demeanor were part of a comic arsenal that was not unlike that of Gracie Allen, George Burns' wife, on the stage foil. Ultimately, however, the line between McQueen's stage or film persona and real life seems to have become increasingly obscured. After the 40s, she disappeared from the scene, appearing briefly with Ethel Waters in the Beulah television show as Oriel in the early 50s, and then working on the odd jobs as laborer and servant before taking on the local radio show in Georgia. Her career revived in the 60s when she appeared in Curly McDimple in 1968, an off-Broadway production, but sputtered again with an infrequent appearances on television during the 70s. Although McQueen did resurface in movies, The Finks in 1970, The Amazing McQueen, and Amazing Grace in 1974, with the venerable moms Mabley and Stephen Fetching, and made a few television appearances in the 80s. Her career had come to a virtual halt. McQueen was enigmatic and evanescent, both on the and off the stage. In some ways, her life and career rival the kind of shocking tales found in the cult compendium of Filmland Misfortunes, Hollywood Babylon. Observed from outside, there is an eccentric, tragicomic, tragicomic cast to her life, just as there was to the characters she played in films. Yet Butterfly McQueen always seemed buoyed to access to by access to a private inner sanctum. It provided an indelible subjective edge to her comic performances and perhaps offered a sanctuary from the vicissitudes of her off-screen life. What is vicissitudes? Vicissitudes. We're gonna see what that is, and that will be the end of section 4. Vicissitudes. 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 Let's see what it is. Let's see if I'm pronouncing it right. VICI. At the top, vicissitudes.
Vicissitude.
Vicissitude. Vicissitude.
Vicissitude.
A change of circumstances or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. Vicissitude. Vicissitude. Perhaps offered a sanctuary from the vicissitudes of her off-screen life. And that's McQueen. McQueen. And that was section 4. That was section 4 of chapter 6 of On the Real Side by Mel Watkins, man. Yeah, there was some words in there, man. You could tell, like when I'm reading some of these big words, I feel like I'm it definitely feels like a newspaper article. I definitely get the sense of the newspaper article, especially with the words used, trying to find the right words to describe certain people and certain things and acts. And these words that they're using are definitely words that people do not use on a regular, or at least I don't hear people use these words like vicissitudes. I have not heard anybody use the word vicissitude in just regular conversation, or acerbic. Acerbic. These aren't everyday usage words, but it's all gravy. It's all great. We're going to keep pushing, man. One word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, until we finish the book, until we see if there's anything that we can learn and grow from any of these books. Is there any knowledge that we can take and pull and keep in our mental memory banks to help us get through the things that we're going through in our lives? Maybe it can help us take a better direction. Maybe it can help us understand things that we're seeing, and maybe even being misled by, so that way we can counteract those things. Who knows? It's many things that the knowledge can be used as a tool to help you with. Only you are the one to know how to use that tool in your life. So maybe there's something that is in it for you. History is history, or it's part of our story. As it says, it's a history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. So it is a part of the story. Somebody's story, Miss McQueen's story, Miss McDaniel's story, or Mom Mabel's story. It's a part of their story. These are some of the things they had to go through. Would you be, and are you still that type of person that'll take those type of roles, in life to succeed, to survive? Will you take the serving role? A lot of us still are. We're still to this day taking the serving role. We're still to this day taking the entertainer roles, the make me laugh nigga roles, Sing, boy, dance, boy, shuck and jive, boy. We still taking a lot of these roles. Yes, there are money in these roles, but sometimes is what come with the roles. You sell yourself short. You sell yourself short for a piece of that American pie. Can you turn them American pies into nigger pies? But we're in there. We're in there for this section, or this session of Reading with SHILO. We're going to keep pushing, man. We're going to keep pushing. So shalom, everybody. I hope y'all have a wonderful evening, night, morning, whenever it is that you see this. Do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe, man. Help the algorithm. It'll help the page, help the channel grow. Let's keep pushing, man. Let's keep pushing and acquiring the knowledge that's in these big old books, or in the little books, all the medium-sized books. Just let's push, man. Let's push. Let's push. Who knows? Who knows what we can learn? Who knows? Shalom.